never a court decision called for more discussion. This is clearly it. Joining us, two former federal prosecutors, CNN legal analyst Shan Wu and CNN senior legal analyst Laura Coates. Laura, you've had a chance to process now the Pennsylvania Supreme Court decision. Do you think it is reasonable or unreasonable purely from a legal perspective?
On a legally procedural basis, the decision was actually reasonable. But of course, we can't look at it in a vacuum, can we? We know that there is the emotion. We know about the silencing of voices of victims of sexual assault. We know about the notion of this being the first case in the METOO movement to actually be prosecuted and for a verdict to be rendered. And the Supreme Court in Pennsylvania never said that Bill Cosby was innocent. They did not address the substance of the factual allegations, nor did they say that the prosecutors in that case failed to meet their burden of proof. The jury found him guilty. What they did say, however, was that, look, a deal is a deal. And it wasn't Bruce Castor in his personal capacity that created and executed this deal that effectively immunized Bill Cosby. He did it in his public capacity on behalf of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And for that reason, even though another successful prosecutor came in to handle the case, the Commonwealth itself would still be bound. And so this court was saying, look, the deal stands as is. It has greater implications, of course. The notion that it was a bait and switch, they used that language to suggest that anybody who was going to rely on the statements of a prosecutor only to have the rug pulled out underneath them later on, it would probably undermine the integrity of those agreements. But of course, when it comes to specific facts in this case, we know why it's so controversial. We know all the stakes involved. We know that although this case involved one named victim, we know the allegations made by dozens, upwards of 50 others. And so this is a very visceral reaction from so many people. But on the idea of whether a prosecutor's deal must be bound and honored by prosecutors, they made the right call there.
And to be clear, this court did not question whether or not the events took place. But Shan, when you go back and look at this trial, remembering what was going on in 2018, did you see any red flags back in 2018?
I did. And, let me share Laura's position that this is a devastating blow. I mean, we have both tried sex offense cases. There's nothing worse to put a survivor through this and then have the conviction overturned. I saw the red flags because in the first trial, which was a mistrial, they only let in one so-called other crimes evidence. The second time around, when they got the conviction, the judge, without laying a very good record, put in a lot of other crimes evidence. And there was this issue of what kind of deal had really been cut by Castor. This is a lesson for prosecutors, something we all learn. You can't just win the conviction. You have to protect it. And that effort to protect it starts a long time before the appeal. This was something they knew about. They needed to really vet and anticipate this. And that's something that it looks like they didn't do. And I don't like this decision, but I agree with Laura. It's legally a defensible position. And really my question is, why wasn't this case tried in 2005? And I think we know the reason for that.
Well, that is the big question here, right? Bruce Castor, who made this deal with Cosby that said, if you testify in this civil trial, there will be no criminal charges brought against you. He was the guy who decided not to bring the criminal charges. Laura, how unusual is that kind of deal?
Well, look, prosecutors every day make these sort of cost-benefit analysis. It's all about the burden of proof. Remember, we're talking about a case that is illustrative of so many others. We're talking about delayed reporting or sexual assault cases in general. You've got the idea of a he said, she said without other physical evidence to corroborate or substantiate the claims. That does not mean it did not happen, but it is a consideration for a prosecutor to know whether they can meet their burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt in the criminal context. Oftentimes, they will maybe suggest, or perhaps that was part of the conversation, about the fact that there is a lower burden of proof in the criminal context. It's not the beyond a reasonable doubt, it's preponderance of evidence, it's a lower threshold. My understanding is that Bruce Castor at the time did not believe they had enough to meet their burden of proof criminally, and so offered this immunity as a way of allowing Andrea Constant to have the benefit of a deposition of Bill Cosby. Remember, he would not have made any statements in a deposition if he believed he could be prosecuted based on those statements later on. We all know that phrase in Law and Order, right? Anything you say can or will be used against you in a court of law. But for that immunity, he would not perhaps have made those statements. So we're in a catch-22 here. The prosecutors in the new trial would not have been able to use that evidence against him had he not said it. But the Supreme Court said essentially, look, it's not whether Bill Cosby should have been acquitted. They did not say that. The question is whether he should have been tried at all based on that particular agreement. And we see the cost-benefit analysis of somebody like Bruce Castor and weighing whether he thought he could then meet his burden of proof. We saw ultimately the jury thought you could.
And Shan, the fact is, as you said at the beginning, for the more than 50 women who've come out with accusations against Bill Cosby, this stinks, right? This stinks. They're seeing this play out before their eyes. And do they, legally it may be sound, but do they have any recourse at this point?
I don't think they really do. On the criminal front, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court was clear as day saying that it's over. I just don't really see any further recourse. And, one thing I'm going to slightly differ with Laura on is I am second-guessing Castor's decision back in 2005. I think he should have stayed out of this, whatever it was, immunity or not. A criminal prosecutor decides, do I charge criminally or not? If he didn't want to charge, that's fine. He shouldn't have done any other kind of arrangement because that ultimately is what doomed this case.
Laura,
and just so we're clear, I wanted to say, Shan, to support you, just so you're clear, I do not suggest that Bruce Castor made the correct decision, but it is a balancing of what I know prosecutors do. But ultimately, the jury found that there was enough evidence. Imagine had it been tried back when it was first brought to the prosecutor's office in 2004. Where would we be now? Probably a conviction still.
Laura Coach, Shan Wu, again, thank you both.